Welcome back to Asemio Decoded. We are officially back for season 4, and we are thrilled to be here. We've switched to a bi-monthly schedule because we are juggling this show with a jam-packed year, and we are committed to continuing to deliver high-quality interviews with incredible leaders on thought-provoking data and technology concepts. So expect new episodes this month, then in May, then July. You get the idea. We're actually starting this season off with a re-release from our very first season when we were still getting our podcasting sea legs. This is a 2022 interview with Dr. Amy O'Hara of Georgetown University's Massive Data Institute. And I am so excited to bring this interview to you in our newer format because she is such a critical voice in data linkage and analysis. Get ready for an abbreviated list of her accomplishments. Dr. Amy O'Hara received her PhD in economics from the University of Notre Dame. Once a senior executive in the U.S. Census Bureau, where she founded their Administrative Data Curation and Research Unit, she is now a research professor in the Massive Data Institute and executive director of the Federal Statistical Research Data Center at the McCourt School for Public Policy at Georgetown University. She has authored publications such as The Nature of the Bias When Studying Only Linkable Person Records, Evidence from the American Community Survey in 2014, The Opportunities and Challenges of Using Administrative Data Linkages to Evaluate Mobility in 2017, and Data Sharing in the Federal Statistical System, Impediments and Possibilities in 2019, to name a few. A staunch proponent of methods such as privacy-enhancing technologies to improve secure data access, Amy serves as the president of the Association for Public Data Users, has provided expertise on data projects funded by the Gates Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and others, chaired the 2024 International Population Data Linkage Conference. We could truly keep going on. Amy is going to blow you away, even if you've already heard her original episode. I know you're going to love her dry humor, her blunt honesty about the roadblocks she's faced, and her forward-thinking answers to critical questions of administrative data access and science communication. So without further ado, let's get into our interview with Dr. Amy O'Hara.
The real answer is that I do this out of spite.
I knew it'd be something really poignantly human.
Something that's difficult to glean from public statements I may have made. No, it's my earliest attempts to use population level administrative data were just so challenging. And I was willing to navigate these horrible pathways to data access once, but I didn't want to do it again and again. I wanted to make sure that I had a repeatable process, or at least was clearing the path for others.
Okay, so typically when you think about data, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Maybe your search history, your bank account numbers, your biometric data. Administrative data isn't that. Per the Census Bureau's website, administrative data is data collected and maintained by federal, state, and local governments, and some other entities like nonprofits, that's used to administer or run programs and provide services to the public. This often includes really sensitive information about people, like their tax returns or enrollment in certain benefit programs, so it's not easy to get. But it's critical that researchers have ways to use this data to get an accurate picture of need or to challenge assumptions about programs and systems that aren't backed by data. More on that later. Amy has made it a focal point of her career to point out how vital analyzing these records are. She may not even realize it, but what she's doing is not very far off from the work of a historian. Some of the most valuable primary sources historians can use to get a picture of societies in the past are their administrative records, like court records, public school enrollments, health records, etc. So remember, next time you have to fill out a frustratingly long form or sift through your own organization's administrative data, you're contributing to our collective memory of things that really happened and some of the best primary sources to ever exist.
I would say that a lot of my efforts to clarify data governance and identify and elevate precedents that exist in different domains, accessing different troves of sensitive data, it really has been to get back at the people that blocked in the first place.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too.
Because many of them were, they weren't doing it because of some deep concern for privacy or because what I was asking was illegal. They just didn't want to. They needed to be informed of the benefits of doing it. And then sometimes you would explain to people, this really has this is low-hanging fruit. if you work with us to get this done, all these good things will happen. They'll be like, yeah, I'm just not really interested.
I will say that a lot of what drew us into the analytics space was just, I was looking at the private sector and comparing with the time cycles and access that you have with public interest.
Yeah.
And I was just flabbergasted. Like, people waiting months and years for data sharing agreements and to get access to data that they're analyzing. And then, you can't tell whether an intervention is good because it's already the problem's shifted and moved on.
2,000 years later.
So a lot of that, just impatience and lack of being able to move the problem forward drives a lot of the work that we do as well.
I think you gave us some really awesome insight into the why. And tell us a little bit more about the what. We shared a brief bio at the beginning of this podcast, and I'd love to hear it in your words.
What I do now is so different than what I think I was originally trained for. I'm an economist by training, and in order to do economic research, that's where I first encountered some of the high hurdles to getting administrative data. And the project, I was working on tax modeling. So you collect a bunch of survey data and you say, let's compute the tax liabilities. And I was doing that. And I had to make all of these assumptions about, here's a complex household, this multi-generational household, a household with a whole lot of adults and a whole lot of kids. And we aren't sure who goes with whom, right? We don't know the relationship details on the relationships, either really the family relationships or even the economic dependency. And yet here I am trying to figure out who's going to file their tax return and who's going to claim which kids as their dependents. And you hear a lot of this chatter from people inside the IRS that there's a lot of fraud and the same kid gets claimed a whole bunch of times. But you also know that there are a lot of people that don't understand the economic benefit of claiming kids. And so there are a lot of kids that never appear in the tax data. So here I am trying to make assumptions. And I'm like, why am I doing this without any information if I could try to check my work against actual taxpayer behavior? And so I went down this pathway to try to use those data matched at the person level. So survey data, household survey, IRS data. How do you do the person level match? How do you assess this? How do you turn it around and make better statistics from it? In addition to that, it was all about legal agreements. It was about data transfer. It was about dealing with the IT security parts of it. It was dealing with training to prevent unauthorized access. It was privacy protection. Are the statistics that I'm generating going to be somehow disclosive? Is it meeting the privacy protections of both the survey and the IRS? Because there it's a race to the bottom. Like, you need to find which one is most conservative and make sure that your results are satisfying that. I was using the survey data and trying to model which kids went with which families. And when I matched it to the tax data the first time, I was right 80% of the time, right? So that's not bad, but it was horrible for the 1 in 5 that I was getting wrong, because that meant that the government statistics that would result from that bad modeling would make you think that people were taking advantage of these tax credit programs where they might not be.
Well,
If you've seen the headlines lately, you saw this enormous drop in child poverty because of the stimulus that went out and the tax credits and things like that during the pandemic. And so if you're not getting the data right, you're getting the inferences wrong.
Amy is talking about the huge drop in the child poverty rate that the U.S. saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. With no data, you might assume a global pandemic would raise poverty rates. But the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities reported in 2024 that the American Rescue Plan's child tax credit expansion and stimulus payments, in conjunction with other relief measures, spurred the largest one-year drop in child poverty on record in 2021. In 2022, the expiration of that aid led to a historic increase in child poverty, the largest rise since 1967. As a result, 5 million more children lived in poverty in 2022 compared to 2021, despite other economic recovery efforts, and racial and ethnic inequities and child poverty have risen back to pre-pandemic levels. CBPP was able to publish this analysis thanks to the access they had to government administrative data on these programs and on poverty rates across the U.S. Amy spoke earlier about the discrepancy between assumptions about IRS tax fraud and what the data showed. That, plus this interesting data from the pandemic, reveals an important lesson about the potential harms of bias, false conclusions, and misrepresentations of truth when there is a lack of reliable data. A 2023 article titled Study Bias from the National Library of Medicine defines bias as any tendency that limits impartial consideration of a question or issue, or, specifically in academic research, a type of systematic error that can distort measurements and/or affect investigations and their results, and says, interpreting the presence of bias involves understanding that it is not a dichotomous variable where the results can either be present or not present. Rather, it must be understood that bias is always present to some degree due to inherent limitations in research, its design, implementation, and ethical considerations. It is instead crucial to evaluate how much bias is present in a study and how the researchers attempted to minimize any source of bias. Administrative data provides a path for identifying instances of bias and misrepresentations because it's data about what actually happened.
Making sure that you're able to explain to people why you're using data, why are you doing those creepy things?
Stop, you're scaring me. You're scaring me.
You've got to have a good answer to that. It can't just be because I was curious.
Makes a special kind of person for like secure multi-party computation, right? Differential privacy. You know? I mean, just not a lot of people, this is their little version of hell to be living in, to have to like think about those things every day.
Well, I mean, I look back at even my time at the Census Bureau, in the olden days, it was all about cell size. If your statistics were based on, a table cell that had more than 30 people, a lot of people didn't have to look at it. You just had to have an attestation that your cell sizes were appropriate. And now there's just so much more scrutiny because there are so many more risks.
But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the advisory committee.
It has been an honor to serve on that committee. I'm deeply interested in how it can all work out, really. Anybody that's not familiar with it, this was it's also known as the Evidence FACA, a Federal Advisory Committee. It's people trying to figure out how the implementation of the Evidence Act is going to result in a national secure data service.
The 2018 Evidence Act bill requires agency data to be accessible and requires agencies to plan to develop statistical evidence to support policymaking. There are three main sections: Federal Evidence Building Activities, which establishes the Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building that Amy was a subject matter expert on. The Open Government Data Act, which requires public government data assets to be published as machine-readable data. And the Confidential Information Protection Act, which basically ensures that secure, ethical, statistical activities are being conducted for the sake of building evidence. All of this is data governance, setting up the rules and regulations for how, in this case, the federal government will collect, store, and interact with data. As Aaron says in our episode on continuous quality improvement, technology is a tool, but the process is the answer. And as boring and as unsatisfying as that can sound at first, it also opens up the door to endless potential for continuous improvement of processes and their results.
We got to hear from these people in other countries that already have an administrative data service. They have nice things. Why can't we have nice things?
I'll have what she's having.
And so it's really important that you balance the value of that against the risks of having an administrative data service, and also being able to identify who is going to be able to use the service. What's the service going to be able to do right away? What's it going to have to invest in? And, for the sorts of projects that we care about, is it going to be doing data linkage in the clear? Is it going to be employing privacy preserving technologies? And these are all questions that the answer to all of them is, I hope so, or the answer is yes. But it's, just the space is so large. How do you get traction and advance with people starting where they are? Because we're not going to get everybody doing super smart, super tech things. How do you meet the parties where they are and continue to build capacity, but do so in order to use data responsibly and improve policy?
It's, I think, an interesting dynamic of going overseas and seeing what the best practices are in other countries. And on one hand, I'm like, man, and I'm very patriotic. So I've volunteered for my country. There's a lot of the values that we have in the United States that I love, and I want to help like proliferate throughout my lifetime and the generations to come. And American exceptionalism sometimes can be pretty high. And then you go and you look at these places like Estonia or Wales that have these great informatic or government civic systems that are integrated. And you're like, wow, we are really behind the times. And then to your point, you think, oh, well, and like the state like Texas is this larger than many countries, right? When we say National Secure Data Service, what does the service mean on that?
And there's like 16 of us on this committee. And I think that you would get 300 answers if you asked that question of all of us. I'm a bureaucrat at heart. And the service that I often think about is the US Postal Service, right? So this is something that it operates from coast to coast. It has points of connection when you need to mail stuff overseas. It has a set of services that it offers to you as the consumer. And it has a rate setting commission, which I thought like that's why my brain is like US Postal Service is a nice thing to bring up, because there is something called the Postal Rate Commission that helps set those price points, right? Because not every post office is setting them. And I think that that sort of advisory group, a commission that is helping set the guardrails for operation, is definitely something that we're going to need in a national secure data service. Part of it is that it's kind of the vibe. It is a philosophy of what we need to be doing with data, but then it might also be a widget that helps you normalize your data, or a guidebook that describes to you your options whenever you're talking about output privacy protection. It's going to aim to do a lot of these things.
We could do a whole episode on just what service could be, because
Yeah.
a lot of how technology, the level of efficiency and efficacy of technology, it correlates to how well a domain is described.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about the services that come through service infrastructure in a domain, a lot of those things are very difficult to get right because they're humans interacting in those widgets and whatnot. So I'm very interested in seeing what comes out of it, especially the philosophical tenets that could be taken and distributed across the United States into the communities.
I really appreciate the parallel to the Postal Service that is validating. We're in the process right now of co-authoring a piece with Tulsa Innovation Labs, a partner here in Tulsa. And we're discussing this parallel of data and digital infrastructure to highway infrastructure and municipal infrastructure. So it's just validating that other people are thinking about it in the same ways that we are, because you have all of these other things that come along with it, the governance, getting folks to understand what the purpose is, how it's going to benefit them, what are the risks, et cetera.
Does this count as a callback to our Decoding Architecture episode if this interview was technically recorded 2 years before that one? Either way, check it out if you want to go down the rabbit hole of whether data is actually more like our physical infrastructure than we think.
We've shared the stage a number of times, particularly the two of you, in discussing privacy-enhancing technologies. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about those.
I think it's really important to get to kind of demystify what privacy enhancing technologies are. In my studies of this, there were organizations that were using them that didn't know it.
Amy says we need to demystify PETs, so let's give it a try. Privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs, are advanced tools designed to protect personal data while still allowing for useful application. These technologies are key to performing two critical functions: analyzing data in ways that do not expose personally identifiable information, and enabling the secure sharing of insights without transferring actual data. For instance, consider a scenario where we are looking to increase support for students by integrating educational data with benefits information. So normally linking those records might risk privacy violations. However, with PETs, you can process these data sets to identify students who need additional resources without ever exposing their PII. So you can make decisions and allocate resources based on those insights, all while complying with stringent data privacy laws and maintaining confidentiality. And this is a lot of what we do and what we want to promote in public good spaces, because we've seen firsthand how PETs can speed up collaborative processes, cut research cycle times down, and put the control, importantly, back in the hands of the people who own and are stewards of that data. This heightens everyone's security and level of trust in data sharing projects. It doesn't take people completely out of the equation, though. Someone has to interpret the findings into a narrative, and critics of PETs point out that they can be complicated to use and that when employed incorrectly, there can be unintended consequences. So if you find yourself working with PETs, it's important that experienced technologists, ideally with a vested interest in public good and keeping people safe, are leading the way.
It's very similar to AI, that you talk to an organization and they're like, oh, we're not doing any of that. And we're like, well, you might want to look at some of the services that you're calling because they are. So then you are too. So it's getting this awareness, and not in a shaming way, not saying like, haha, caught you, you're using it, but saying, see, it's not that creepy or it's not that out there. And also, I think it's really important that we stop thinking about them as there's this one or that one or that one. This is like a smudged together suite of products, of options for people to use. And it would seldom be the case that you just use one of them and you're like, now I'm done. You need to figure out how these technologies click together or stack together so that you are moving the needle toward better protection while maintaining efficiency. We don't have a pile of these little pamphlets to help the community understand what they need to be aware of or what they might achieve, because there's so much of the privacy enhancing tech work is still developmental, right? There's a lot of it that is ready for prime time and can be used today, which is great. But then when you look at the literature, there are these constant improvements on it or new things being tried and added, and that too is great. But that is sometimes very scary to people that you're trying to say, would you consider adopting this? They're like, is it even mature enough for me to do so? We need to have more proof points that show this was the problem, this is what was used, this was the outcome, end of story. That isn't something being presented in an IEEE or an ACM, like one of these heavy duty computer science venues.
We need less technologists selling snake oil. Just in general, I say that as a technologist, because that really muddies the waters when you overpromise with technology and then people invest a lot of dollars into it and don't see the benefit of it.
That's really tricky, Aaron, because when I was in my mind imagining a whole bunch of these like little pamphlets that show you the examples, like these are the use cases that have tried different types of privacy enhancing technologies. If those are written by the technology companies, by the vendors, they're just going to look like, PR fluff.
Wait, is this a play about us?
But if they are written by scholars, the scholars have an incentive to get them into peer-reviewed literature, which means they're going to be basically unreadable to the next person that's considering adoption.
Right.
So how do you get the gray literature to develop in this space where it isn't just marketing material, but it also isn't this very unreadable academic work that is talking about theories? You want somebody writing about the practice.
There are so many terms in academia that sound so similar, and it's so confusing sometimes. So let's pause. Gray literature is basically anything that isn't formally published in an academic journal, meaning it isn't peer-reviewed. It might be a pamphlet from a nonprofit or a government report or a white paper from a technology company like Asemio. Peer-reviewed literature means that a researcher wrote a paper, submitted it to a journal, the journal sent it to other experts to review, and those reviewers decide whether the paper has academic merit based on their evaluation of the research process used, the sources cited, and the conclusions drawn. Peer review is basically the gold standard when it comes to citing evidence and establishing empirical facts. Amy's saying we need more gray literature about data because while it isn't as citable as something peer-reviewed, it is generally more accessible. We have an issue in academic writing, especially when it comes to complex data analysis. Sometimes it's just completely inaccessible, and nobody except experts in their fields can understand it. So that adds to a lot of the fear about tech that already exists in the public domain. People tend to fear things that they don't understand. It's very human. And that's partially why we created this podcast. We need more accessible ways to understand technology and scientific concepts. As Amy says, we need to think more proactively about the story we want to tell about this work and tell it in a way that is accessible and interesting to a wide range of audiences for many years to come. Storytelling is the core cultural practice that binds humans together. Shouldn't be too hard, right?
There are people that do this work at the state and local level. And there are people that do this work at the federal level. And there are domain specific groups. You've got health and health informatics and public health, and you've got a lot of people in justice. There are a bunch of people doing criminal justice, and Georgetown and others are working in civil justice. How are you going to get the word out across them? And then something else that I'm sensitive to, they've never been in a tent together. For example, there are a bunch of people in the US that do historical linkages. Like, these are mostly social scientists that are doing a lot of genealogical research. And it's really cool, good person level data linkage, right? We love this stuff. And those are often people that are pushing on some of the techniques that we're using. Like, they get good code written because they want it to be running and they can continue adding to their giant longitudinal databases. But they often aren't speaking to the people that are doing what they're doing with electronic health records. These are not necessarily groups that are cross-pollinating. And those are just two examples. Similarly, the folks doing things in Tulsa, or the people that are linking data for the state of Wisconsin, or people in Houston, are they interacting with each other, and do they see that as advantageous?
Cross-pollination is an excellent metaphor for what needs to happen in the scientific research community. Much like the need to crack the code on communicating scientific work to the public, scientists often struggle to communicate with each other. Information silos create inefficiency by closing off scientists of different disciplines from one another and hiding valuable synchronicities among their work. A 2023 essay in the Journal of Science Communication titled "Strengthening Interdisciplinarity in Science Communication Education: Promise, Pleasures, and Problems" points out that cross-disciplinary communication faces institutional and cultural barriers, differences in the language used, norms within respective disciplines, and a lack of interdisciplinary reviewers qualified to assess the academic merit of multidiscipline work. Some interesting work to solve this problem can be found in climate science. As a multifaceted global wicked problem with a growing urgency, climate science depends on interdisciplinary communication in order to link disparate impacts of global shifts in climate in ecology, genetics, anthropology, meteorology, biology, etc.
There's a lot of interest in having the knowledge base built out. And that means different things to different people, but your robot is going to be better if there is more curated information, or, if there's the more information, the more knowledge it gets pointed to, the better its answers are going to be. I think that this is something that we really need to be thinking about and it's related to what I was saying before, like, why don't we have these pamphlets that actually talk about privacy enhancing technologies that were put into practice or attempted? How do we get people to care about that? And part of it, I think, is up to us as solution providers, or a lot of times I'm a solution facilitator. How do you get the client to be willing to have their story told? And again, not in a PR way, but in a, you've got to carry this forward. This is how you can make this path easier for the next group like you. I think there are a lot of people like us that just want to get the widget made, and they would not want to then tell a story. They would not want to write it up with pictures in a way that's very digestible. But that's something that I think that if we don't regularly at least say, yeah, that's a problem, I think we need to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it hopefully will put us on a path to addressing it.
One of the things that frustrates me to no end is we talk about evidence-informed decision-making, or we talk about all over the place, whether it's collective impact or pay for success or results-based leadership. Data is an element of the work that we're doing. So, and a lot of people understand, and the more nuanced people in this space understand, that it's not the technology, but technology actually can help. So it's not just not the technology either. But then you get in this place where when you look at the technology, and I'm going to separate out these concepts of data and technology, right? Because those are decoupled, right? But advancing technology infrastructure does enable you, if you're doing it well and right, to get access to better and more data in a timely nature, okay? So now this concept of creating data and technology ecosystems, because I'm slipping something else in here. I'm slipping in Aaron's personal opinion.
That's just like your opinion, man.
We're not going to centralize. We're not going to have the one system that rules them all. Okay.
Right.
So I'm going to say ecosystem there. Is it a lost cause to try and figure out a measurement system for how we measure the growth or advancement of a data and technology ecosystem? Is that just such a complex or amorphous or abstract thought that it's like, Aaron, just don't quit drinking wine and trying to come up with an answer to this impossible question? Or do you think that there's some hope there to be able to one day be able to compare data and technology ecosystem development approaches or specific technologies that plug in or something like that?
I would like there to be, or I hope so. That's probably an answer.
It's pretty wild to go back to an episode from 2022 and hear ourselves talking about our wishes for a way to measure community data ecosystems. It's a problem we're steeped in now, and to some degree we always have been. Some of our foundational thinking on this is in our white paper from back in 2016, Architecting Resilient and Adaptive Communities Through Technological Innovation, where we established an early framework for understanding the critical components in a data ecosystem. Since then, we've refined the way we think about this quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to getting the chance to share more of that with you in future episodes.
The folks at DataVant hosted an event called The Future of Health Data. And the last session of that event was the CEO of a company called Centene. I got to tell you, I had never heard of Centene before, but it's this company that has apparently been accumulating lots of managed care organizations and now has an almost unthinkable amount of data, especially on the Medicaid population, right? So this is like vulnerable populations. And that I was really struck by their CEO's answer to a very similar question, Aaron. And she was like, I am not going to impose one system on all of these companies that we are now over. And we recognize that even the best of those systems is going to become outdated. And so we are just kind of thinking it is our job to make sure that everything is as efficient as possible as we are reading from these. And I think that, like that CEO, I think of this as an evolution. And I think it's really important to leave down markers of where you were so that you can see where you are now. And also to be very transparent about what you're doing so that when you look in the rearview mirror and you're like, that was a terrible thing, let's make sure we don't do that again. That's important. But if your measurement goal is trying to get ahead of that, I don't know if I don't know if there are going to be resources to both evolve where we are and also impose some sort of an analytic framework on top of it. And I'm not sure who would set those standards. And I guess that's part of what worries me. Had this been something, say, in the EHR space, would have you let the vendors decide what that would have looked like? Is this happening right now in the platform space? Like, are the engineers at Facebook deciding this? Does it need to get out of hand and then government regulation steps in? Because what you're describing, it isn't something that, the people at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, they're not like, yeah, let's go solve that problem. So I'm not sure, but I'm intrigued by it. I would like that to happen, but I would also be happy enough with some of the more mundane tracking pieces. Because I think that you were talking about some analytics thing that could be optimized. And I'm like, dude, let's just try to figure out if we can keep track of what's going on.
Curious to hear more about this concept of design thinking? Check out our Decoding Architecture episode that I mentioned earlier. Amy and Aaron are two examples of design thinkers, people who are actively innovating and thinking about new solutions to old and new problems. At Asemio, we sometimes compare data architects and engineers to woodworkers. It's a mix of science and art, a craft that you hone after years of experience, you learn from others in the trade, and often you're pushing boundaries to define your unique style without compromising the integrity of the piece that you're building.
What is an insight?
Yeah.
Let's just start there.
Yeah.
Can we agree on, is it a report? Is it a dashboard? Is there categories of insights? And then how long does it take typically to get an insight?
Yeah.
Is it different at the federal or the state or the regional level? What's the cost of an insight? It's super, tactical and mundane and process boring kind of stuff.
Boring.
But as we're building out our knowledge and we're looking at these, the gray paper space, and we're kind of building out systems, I'm really intrigued on who starts tracking, like who starts saying how much it actually costs?
So on the advisory committee on data for evidence building, I've been chairing the technical infrastructure subcommittee, and we are supposed to be thinking about what could be, what should be explored. And I'm an economist and I'm like a former bureaucrat. And so I was like, how much is that going to cost? Who's going to pay for that? How are you going to keep that running? And they're like, stay in your lane. That's not what you're supposed to be looking at. And it was so hard because there are some things that are like, wouldn't that be wonderful? Let's talk about this wonderful thing. But meanwhile, my brain is like, you're never going to have that one, or you'll have that wonderful thing for 6 months, but then no one's going to have the money to keep it, like to sustain it. So I hear you. Like, what are the ways that you can get that normalized as part of the conversation? You know, I think that for better or worse, some of the blockchain stuff is like, it really has people looking at the energy utilization. And so, you know, there are dollar costs and then our psychic costs about that.
Right.
But that was something, it took time for that to happen. And so maybe that we just need to observe this long enough for some of these other considerations to be important enough to measure.
Okay, for the third and final time this episode, I will say, listen to Decoding Architecture to hear more about this. Energy use for blockchain was a hot button topic in the 2010s, but wait until you hear about the energy strain that AI is putting on our power grids in the 2020s. And as a bonus, if you want to dive deep on what the heck blockchain is and whether Aaron is a big fan of the hype, we have a Decoding Blockchain episode for you too.
So I brought up fight, and then you just brought up, what was the word?
Impatience.
Frustration
And impatience go hand in hand.
And then I think that for another time that we should talk about fear, because to me that would be like the other piece that's brought in here. What are you afraid of? What are you scared
I think that,
of?
like, can we dab?
Yeah, we totally. You can't. Yes, we can dabble in fear.
I'm afraid if we don't talk about it now, we won't get to it.
Oh, that's a good one. This comes back, Aaron, whenever we talk about privacy enhancing technologies. Are you going to get people to adopt them because you scare them? Or, you know, like what are your tactics here? Similarly, when you talk about data management, it may be incredibly efficient to amass the data and have an integrated data system. And a lot of people that have integrated data systems may not want to discuss a federated data model because they've already invested so much in the other. And so what do you need to talk about the fear of a honeypot, the fear of these breaches? And then another part of fear is the fear of people's data being misused, even with the privacy protection. Like, I think that culturally and politically, we've got a lot of work ahead of us to get people on board with broader use of their data. It's
like there's plenty of fear to go around, but it's not always in the right place. I'm like, you should be afraid. Just this other places where you should be afraid. One of the interesting things that I found is I thought at first when we were advancing our advocacy efforts for privacy enhancing technologies, there would be a benefit to say, oh, look, you're afraid of all these things. And this helps with that. And I haven't seen people go, oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Our privacy and security fears are allayed now. Let's put in PETs. That's just not the case.
Yep.
It's not the case at all. I think what I have seen work though is people are very they're very personally focused. Like they have a personal mission to solve problems or help those that they're working with to advance equity for good. And they also have personal goals to not run afoul of FERPA and HIPAA and 42 CFR. And once you can allay those fears, I've seen that work. Yeah. And so strangely, when I talk about a big, all the ways that the cryptographic, mechanisms help protect their data, that doesn't work. But if I'm like, look, it's going to meet your compliance and security standards, then like, oh, great. So I guess how do you walk that tightrope of being honest, being transparent, lifting the value up that's huge in many instances, but also like not oversigned so that people are like, oh, well, my data would never be compromised.
Right. No, I think that this is really the challenge. And I think this is where you need the honest storytellers that are going to come out and say, this is what can be done. But also, while being very blunt, that there is no perfectly safe way of releasing your data. There's always going to be some amount of risk that is accepted for doing anything. So it's getting people to even acknowledge that what they're doing is risky.
That's all for this re-release and first episode of our 4th season. If you enjoy listening to Asemio Decoded and want to support, please consider subscribing and leaving us a review. It helps us get seen across some different platforms, and we'll be back with our first fresh interview of the season in May. So thanks for listening and learning with us.